Welcome to another episode of Scotland Then, a slightly longer than normal episode, but I hope you enjoy it. In this episode, I'll be highlighting newspaper stories taken from the Daily Record on the 16th, 18th, 22nd and 23rd of March 1967, around the time of Pat McAdam's disappearance. You'll find all the sources I used for this episode by visiting scottishmurders.com/episodes/Pat McAdam. A couple of the stories in this episode are around shocking child abuse, so listener discretion is advised, but I will give a trigger warning before I begin these stories. Other stories in this episode include an all-out major disaster plan of the type that would be used in the event of a nuclear attack being carried out, and how a missing girl was found after many distressing hours, not to be missing at all. So let's head back to March 1967 for all this and more. The first article that stood out was beside a picture of a man being carried on a stretcher to an ambulance, with the headline reading, "Terror of Man Trapped 8 Hours in Clay." According to an article in the Daily Record on the 16th of March, Alec Robertson, a 50-year-old father of 6, endured a harrowing 8-hour ordeal after becoming trapped up to his neck in tons of shifting clay at a private clay mine in West Lothian. The incident occurred around 10 a.m. while Alec Robertson was working inside a 50-foot hopper alongside 16-year-old Alec Black. It all began when lorry driver William Parker unknowingly positioned his truck beneath the hopper's chute, unaware that 2 men were inside. As the clay shifted, Alec Robertson was swept down the chute. He did, however, manage to grab hold of a crossbar, which, along with his height, being about 6 foot or 1.8 metres, prevented him from being completely buried. When the clay had stopped moving, Alec was left trapped and immobilised by it, right up to his neck, with his hands above his head. For the first 3 hours, 16-year-old Alec Black, an ambulance man and the lorry driver William Parker worked continually to prevent Alec Robertson from suffocating by keeping the moving clay away from his nose and mouth. A rescue team eventually cut through the side of the hopper to free Alec, after a harrowing 8 hours. Alec was taken to Bangor Hospital and kept overnight, but a hospital spokesperson confirmed that Alec does not appear to have any serious injuries. "I'm glad it had a happy ending, but 8 hours trapped in a hopper, that's a long time. I wonder why it took 8 hours before somebody thought it finally cut a hole in the side of the hopper. I also hope that the clay mine management put procedures in place to prevent such a thing happening again." The next heading that got my attention was on the 18th of March and read, "Atomic Fear from Gas Leak." The article then went on to say, confusion over a 7-letter word started an all-out nuclear emergency in a Scots town. So what was the confusion? Well, it was a misunderstanding over the word reactor that had triggered the full-scale emergency response in Grangemouth, Stirlingshire, after a gas leak at the Marbon chemical plant was mistakenly believed to involve radioactive material. Okay, so let's see what the full-scale emergency response looked like, and who ultimately misunderstood the word reactor. So the alarm was raised at 7:45 a.m. when a worker discovered a butadiene gas leak from a chemical reactor. However, by 8:07 a.m., 22 minutes later, when Grangemouth police were informed, the word reactor had already sparked fears of a nuclear incident, and within minutes a major disaster plan was activated. Here's what took place. 3 minutes after that, at 8:10 a.m., Grangemouth police contacted their headquarters in Stirling. At 8:15 a.m, police headquarters warned regional hospitals and physicists in Glasgow of potential radioactive danger in Grangemouth. Ambulances and hospitals in the area were also placed on alert at this time. A minute later, at 8:16 a.m, the Scottish Home and Health Department in Edinburgh were notified by the police. At 8:18 a.m, senior police officials were briefed of the reactor leak, and emergency communications and traffic control were placed on standby. At 8:25 a.m, police reinforcements arrived in Grangemouth, and roadblocks were set up around the town. Loudspeaker vans also drove around the area and warned residents to stay indoors, and schools were instructed to keep children inside. Just over an hour after the alarm had been raised, at 8:45 a.m, police learned the leak involved gas, not radiation, but that food and water supplies may be at risk of contamination. At 9 a.m, radiation expert Dr. J.K. Thompson was brought in from a nearby plant to assist police. At 8:10 a.m, police contacted the Decca tracking station at Earls Hill to check wind direction and weather forecast. At 9:25 a.m, less than an hour and a half after the alarm was first raised, police lifted the roadblocks after Chief Inspector Andrew Mackenzie confirmed the reactor was chemical, not atomic. So despite it being a misunderstanding, it must have been good to know that if such an emergency did occur, prompt and concise plans were in place. After the incident, Marban Chemicals financial controller, Mr. Daniel Craig, clarified, "We have nothing radioactive in our plant." And a senior officer at Stirling Police Headquarters admitted, "We appear to have been the culprits who misinterpreted the word reactor." Okay, so trigger warning here. The next two stories talk about appalling child abuse, so please skip ahead for a few minutes if you'd prefer not to listen. It made me quite sad that two child abuse cases appeared in court within a day of each other, and the sentences the abusers received, in my opinion, just didn't fit the crimes. The first article appeared in the Daily Record on Thursday the 23rd of March, when the parents of 3-year-old George, father Victor Barry, who was 24, and mother Alice, who was 22, appeared at a court hearing charged with ill-treating and neglecting George at their home in Kilsyth, with Victor Barry being further charged with willfully assaulting George by beating him on the face, head, body and legs. George's parents denied these charges. At the hearing, a Dr. Andrew Blair said he had found 95 distinct injuries on George, and that upon George being admitted to Stob Hill Hospital as an emergency patient, he was found to be undernourished. Victor's mother appeared as a witness for her son, saying that her son loved the wee boy George and that he always clung to his daddy. The jury of 8 women and 7 men took almost an hour to find the Barrys guilty as charged, with 3-year-old George's mother, Alice, apparently weeping as the verdicts were announced, and their solicitor stated outside of the court that, "We will certainly appeal." The sheriff then addressed Victor and Alice Barry and said that they had carried out a prolonged series of brutal assaults on a defenceless child, their own son, and that due to this, "I find it impossible to be lenient in view of the manifold of evidence of brutality." However, the sentences George's parents received, in my opinion, were extremely lenient. Victor Barry being sentenced to 9 months for the assault charge and 3 months for the neglect charge to run concurrently, and Alice Barry being placed on probation for 2 years. But the next story got even worse when 24-year-old Ronald Russell appeared in court the day before, charged with seizing his 5-month-old baby Anne-Marie repeatedly by the throat and squeezing it, of punching her on the body and twisting her arms and legs to her severe injury. These offences took place between the 10th of November and the 23rd of December in Russell's home in Pollokshields. This cruelty was uncovered when 5-month-old baby Anne-Marie was admitted to the Sick Children's Hospital on the 24th of December, where both of her legs and arms were found to be broken. In court on the 22nd of March, Russell admitted these offences, and the statement he had given to police upon being questioned was read out in court. It read, "I hit the child with the back of my hand because I could not stop her crying. I took her left leg and started to twist it. I heard a snap. On several occasions, I've hit the baby on the stomach and I've tried to choke her. I tried to do away with her. I've also beaten her about the body and twisted her arms on several occasions until I heard a snap." Children's cruelty officers also told the court that upon them interviewing Ronald Russell, they found his attitude to be one of insolence. At the time of the trial in March, Anne-Marie was still in hospital, having been admitted on the 24th of December the previous year. Unlike the previous child abuse story, at this trial the judge didn't appear to have any stern words for Ronald Russell and clearly felt that he could be lenient despite the extreme brutality, as he sentenced Ronald Russell to 6 months in prison. 6 months. Now, I'm sure, or at least I hope, Anne-Marie, when she had recovered from her atrocious injuries and was able to be released from hospital, she would be safe and looked after by people who loved and cared about her. However, at the time of the trial, the biggest concern seemed to be for Ronald Russell's welfare, as apparently the court heard how he was so scared that he would receive rough justice from other men if he was sent to prison. And it appeared it was being insisted that he be given protective custody, with a spokesperson for the Scottish Government saying after the trial that we can make special arrangements for a prisoner who has been threatened, provided he reports the matter to the governor. Ah well, as long as he was well looked after in prison. But it was the statement made after the trial by 5-year-old Anne-Marie's mother, Dorothy, who was pregnant, that really caused my jaw to drop. She said, "I will stand by my husband," after what he did to his 5-month-old baby because she wouldn't stop crying. I've no words. Okay, so this next story also involves children, particularly children in the Easterhouse area of Glasgow, and them not receiving what they had a right to, with the title headed The Part-Timer. So when I was a child, I went to playgroup until I was about 4 or 5, I can't remember. Then I headed to primary school. Now, while how long children are actually in school for has changed over time, from certainly when I was a kid, we always went to school Monday to Friday for a large chunk of each day, which I know my mum was very grateful for. However, I had no idea that back in March 1967 in Glasgow, Easterhouse in particular, over 2,500 children were only receiving part-time education, with one boy not having gone through a full term without being part-time, and another only receiving 2 hours of schooling a day for 4 years. Wanting to do the best for their children, with children of all ages being affected by this, some mothers had turned to homeschooling their children, but they were worried about whether they were doing the right thing. Were they steering their children in the right direction, as their children were not sent home with any homework to guide them, and there were deep concerns about their children's future without the correct education. With one mother saying, "It's very worrying. I compare my older boy who received a full-time education to my younger boy who is receiving a part-time education, and I know my younger boy is far behind what his brother knew at that age." Apparently, the Bishop Loch School was the worst hit in Easterhouse, with the headmaster of the school saying, "No one likes having to put these children on part-time, but there's no way around it." A headmaster of another primary school also said that, "We are all on a knife edge. We struggle with just enough staff, but one little thing could tip us all over. A teacher leaving or getting married or just going on the sick. Thousands of children are in danger." So what was the reason for this? Well, in short, a lack of teachers. Well, no actually, because according to the article in the Daily Record on the 22nd of March, it was more that teachers weren't being assigned or willing to be assigned to the Glasgow or Easterhouse area. Apparently there were enough teachers if they had been spread out evenly throughout Scotland, where each class on average would have about 23 pupils to each teacher. However, further on in the same article in the Daily Record, it said that there was a teacher shortage in Scotland in general of around 3,700, and that this was predicted to only get worse when the age school leavers left school was raised from 15 to 16 in 1970, with the shortage then being predicted to be nearer 6,400. But in Glasgow specifically, the teacher shortage was estimated to be about 1,300 to rise to 3,300 upon the school leaving age rising to 16. So it appeared something had to be done, but what were the solutions? Well, the Education Committee had been working hard to recruit, emphasising the extreme shortage of teachers in the Glasgow area, but this emphasis was stopped, as they found that the more they reported this, the less likely qualified teachers wanted to go to Glasgow, as who wants to go to an area where you know you're going to be overworked? Another opinion put forward was to have Glasgow excluded from the school leaving age being raised to 16, but this too was excluded. All sorts of perks were also being offered to teachers that were willing to work in Glasgow, including a £100 income bonus being offered, although it took 6 months of deliberation for this to be passed. There was also the possibility of teachers receiving travelling expenses if they were willing to attend and work in schools in neighbouring districts in Glasgow. There was also an agreement made that men teachers, if they had the same training as women, should now be allowed to teach in primary schools. I wonder why men hadn't been allowed to teach in a primary school before. Was it just seen as a job for women? Apparently there was even a campaign to try and recruit married women into teaching, as well as refresher courses aimed at qualified teachers who had left the profession and wanted to come back. Another suggestion was to delay the school's starting age to 7 instead of 4 or 5, with children to stay in playgroups until they were 7, but this too was rejected. Everything was trying to be done to improve this dire situation, which thankfully had drastically improved by 1970 through many of these incentives and more, as well as a major school building programme initiative which had been started in the 1950s and which planned to build many schools in Easterhouse, which had been delayed, finally coming to fruition, so that all the newly qualified and returning teachers had a school to actually teach in. So all's well that ends well. But did you or a family member have to go to part-time at school? How did they feel about that? And did it hinder their future employment? So that was a pretty heavy few stories, so here's a kind of light one. It doesn't start great, but it definitely has a great ending. It involves 9-year-old Wilma Irvin, who gave her family quite a scare when she vanished from her home in Ayrshire one night. When Wilma's mum and dad, William and Sadie, got up in the morning of Wednesday the 22nd of March to get Wilma up and ready for school, Wilma was nowhere to be found. Her parents immediately feared that she may have wandered off in the night, as she was known to sometimes walk in her sleep. And so Wilma's dad, who was a local bus driver, alerted police, and a search of nearby streets, fields, and the local school began. Meanwhile, the Irvins' home became the search headquarters, with relatives and neighbours trying to comfort Wilma's distraught mother and regularly checking in for any updates. It would be a nail-biting 3 hours into the search when Wilma's grandmother, deciding she wanted to do some hoovering, as you do, attempted to move the sofa, but she couldn't shift it. At this time, Wilma's dad, William, had popped in to update on how the search was going, and so the grandmother asked him if he could move the couch for her, but he too noticed the unusual weight of it. He lifted one of the cushions, and lo and behold, there was Wilma, curled up and sound asleep in the narrow space beneath the seat. Thankfully, she was unhurt and blissfully unaware of the upset she had caused. Okay, time for some TV viewing from Wednesday the 22nd of March 1967, most of which I had heard of, but a couple I hadn't, and it still shocks me that some programmes are still on today that were also on back in 1967, such as Coronation Street, which back in 1967 was on STV at 7:30 p.m, and it was the episode where Annie loses a husband and gains a barman. So Annie Walker was the landlady of the Rover's Return back then, and she discovered her husband, Jack's bed, hadn't been slept in, which sparked her suspicions. So I'm not sure if they were separated but living together, or whether they just had separate rooms. Either way, when Jack turned up for work, he told Annie that he'd slept well, and so Annie then thinks that he'd been with another woman. However, he hadn't. In fact, he'd been staying with Albert Tatlock at number 1. I've no idea why, and it doesn't say on the synopsis. If you remember watching this episode, what was he doing at Albert's? Also in this episode, Elsie Tanner returns from holiday, but she's apparently remaining tight-lipped about her trip. I wonder what that was about. Answers on a postcard, please. If you were home at 7:05 p.m. on this Wednesday, you'd also be treated to another episode of Tomorrow's World. Now, I've heard of this programme, but I honestly can't remember if I watched it when I was little, or whether it's because my husband watches clips of this show all the time. So this particular episode showcased the Elliott Light Pen, which was a pioneering computer input device. Riveting stuff. So this was an early innovation which allowed users to interact directly with a computer screen, which was decades ahead of modern touchscreens. It's crazy to think how far we've come from then, with touchscreens now being commonplace. Apparently, this was a significant moment in computing history as it demonstrated the real-time graphical input at a time when most computers still relied on punch cards and typewritten commands. This is more of a TV program for my husband, not so much me. Okay, here's something a bit more fun. Top Cat, or Boss Cat as it was called back then in the UK due to a conflict with a cat food brand. But when I was a kid it was called Top Cat. And the episode on this Wednesday at 5:20 p.m. was called The Unscratchables, with Benny the Ball accidentally swallowing a stolen diamond, which prompted Boss Cat and the gang to go undercover as gangsters to rescue him. Bit of good old-fashioned slapstick fun for a tea time. Okay, so here's one I hadn't heard of. Let's see if you remember it. Softly, Softly, which was on BBC One at 8 p.m. This particular episode was called Appointment in Wyvern. Did you watch Softly Softly? While I'd not heard of this programme, I had heard of Z-Cars, which Softly Softly is a police procedural drama spin-off from. It apparently focused on regional crime squads and CID officers operating in the fictional Wyvern area, which was loosely based on the Bristol region, and it included key characters such as Detective Chief Superintendent Charles Barlow and Detective Sergeant Harry Hawkins. Was this a favourite of yours? Or did it have you reaching for the remote to switch it off? It sounds a bit like The Bill, I guess, to me. Another one for the kids was The Magic Roundabout, which was on after Boss Cat at 5:45 p.m. on BBC One. This particular episode was called Dougal's Glasses, and it featured the beloved shaggy dog Dougal dealing with his vision trouble, which led to humorous interactions with the other characters such as Florence, Zebedee and Brian. I remember watching this as a kid. I think I had a jigsaw off them at one point too. Did you watch this? And if you did you have a favourite character as a kid? I could go on forever reeling off the TV shows from back then, but here's the final one, and it's one I haven't heard of. It was called The Baron, and it was on STV at 8 p.m. And this episode was titled The Man Outside, where John Mannering, aka the Baron, travels to Scotland after the sudden death of his friend and fellow antique dealer Douglas McRae. The coroner rules it an accident, but Mannering suspects foul play, especially when he spots a man in a local pub wearing the antique ring McRae had sent him to retrieve. As Mannering digs deeper, he uncovers a web of American mobsters, secret deals, and a mysterious job McRae was trying to finish before his death. So, the Baron, John Mannering, played by Steve Forrest, is an antiques dealer that drives a Jensen C V8. It sounds awfully like Bergerac to me, or what was the other one? Lovejoy. Apparently 30 colour episodes were produced, which was the basis of the British series between 1965 and 1966, before the show was then exported to America. Do you remember watching this show? What did you think about it? It does sound like something I'd watch, and the intro sequence looks quite edgy. Okay, I'm almost at the end of this episode, but I have a challenge for you. So an article in the Daily Record on the 18th of March was titled, Are You a Word Genius? Basically it said, remember this is back in 1967, that there were 800,000 words in the English language, with well over 2,000 beginning with the letter A. And if you could write down, without any help, 1,500 words starting with A, you were a word genius. If you managed 500, you were specially talented. And if you scraped together 100, you were average. So Peter and I decided to have a go and see how many words beginning with A we could write down within 10 minutes. Peter got 63 and I got 87. So we're very sub-average, but it was hard and our minds just went blank. In fairness though, the article didn't actually say how much time you had to write these words beginning with A down, but we went with 10 minutes. So I'm setting you a challenge. Without using any tools such as autocomplete and without cheating, how many words beginning with A can you write down in 10 minutes? Go! I know I'm absolutely horrendous on social media, but I promise if you do this challenge and tell me on either Instagram, YouTube or Spotify comments or via email, contact@scottishmurders.com, I will get back to you and I'll give the winner a shout out on a future episode. You have until the end of October to get your answers to me. Oh, I'm quite excited. But no cheating now. And that brings us to the end of another Scotland Then episode. I hope you enjoyed it and the challenge I set. My plan is to release a normal Scottish Murders episode next week, and following on from sharing all about Thomas Ross Young and the Pat McAdam case, I'll be doing something similar in the next episode, but there is a very good reason for it. I hope you'll join us next week for that episode, as well as for the mini bonus Halloween episode that's coming out. So until then, I've been your host, Dawn.
Scottish Murders is a production of Clurin Ton.